It's been really effective. So essentially, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has not traveled outside of Ukraine much since the war broke out last February. He has now traveled to the US on one occasion. That was his first trip. And then he went to London, quick stop in Paris, and then to Brussels. On these trips, essentially, every time he goes away, it's about getting some deliverables. And every time he has managed to meet with these leaders in person, he ends up coming away with additional weapons. So he got some commitments from the UK to train additional soldiers. So the UK is training Ukrainians in how to use, for instance, NATO fighter jets. They're also training them in various techniques, and that commitment has increased from 10,000 people being trained to 20,000 Ukrainians being trained. He's also been able to secure more commitments with respect to tanks, which are now, so the EU was for a long time holding back, as was the US and as was Britain, in sending tanks to Ukraine. Now those countries have said that they will actually send those tanks. So these commitments are the commitments that he's able to get in order to, by traveling on these trips, and they're in order for Ukraine to be able to withstand that offensive that is being expected in the spring.
Critical, we understand, is the supply of fighter jets. Now, not all countries have completely signed up to do that. How critical are those fighter jets for Ukraine going forward?
The fighter jets at this point are less critical than the tanks. So no country has said that they're actually going to be providing Ukraine with fighter jets at this point, though we are seeing some signals that there is going to be fighter jet inflow. So that's, for instance, the UK has said that they're going to be training Ukrainians on NATO fighter jets. So that is an indication that they're coming in. But we do know that the fighter jets are more of a long-term goal for Ukraine, whereas the tanks are much more important. They're the things that will allow Ukraine to withstand a huge influx of Russian military over the course of spring. And there are some reports we're seeing that something like as many as 500,000 Russian troops are being amassed at the border with Ukraine at the moment. And for that sort of thing, it really is very crucial for Ukraine to get tanks specifically. And those are the things that they're really focusing on at this point. The jets are a stretch target.
Yeah. How much, the spring offensive that could be just a fortnight away on the anniversary, how much better prepared do you think the Russian military is going to be this time around?
Look, the problem for the Russian military is that you can conscript soldiers, which is what the Russians have done, but it's very difficult to actually train them to effectively fight. And they are running low on all sorts of things, particularly since the EU and the UK and the US have been implementing more and more sanctions. Those sanctions are preventing them from being able to sell things like their oil, which then prevents them from being able to replenish their supplies of machinery, of weaponry, and so forth. We do know they probably have access to a lot of people, but as the Russians themselves on Telegram channels have acknowledged, often these people are being used effectively as cannon fodder. So in terms of how successful this renewed offensive might be, unless the Russians have found a way to get that really advanced military equipment that they've been lacking, it is a question of just a lot of humans being thrown into it, but we don't know that they're going to be much more successful than they have been thus far.
What seems to be quite successful for Russia at the moment is the battle for Bakhmut. What do we understand of the gains being made there, and what role is the Wagner group playing in the gains that have been made in this region?
It looks like probably Bakhmut, which is a pretty key town from a logistics perspective, that it probably will fall to the Russians at some point in the next few days, maybe the next week. In terms of what's happening on the ground there, we know that there is essentially just one road out of Bakhmut left, which is the thing that's preventing Bakhmut from being encircled. The Ukrainians have been defending that city because it is an important one in terms of logistics and in terms of allowing them to then go further. But the Russians have been throwing just enormous amounts of manpower to try to capture that town, and they were able to take out a bridge, which is why we're left with one road now. So we probably anticipate that the Ukrainians will likely lose that town in the immediate term. But the Ukrainians, effectively, they've been retreating and then coming back when they're able to take things back. So we may then see Bakhmut come back into Ukrainian control later. But we do know that it looks like probably the Ukrainian military is going to pull out of Bakhmut in the coming days.
Yeah. It's an interesting issue that President Zelenskyy has been very furious about, and that is the IOC clearing the way for Russian and Belarusian athletes to compete at the Olympics. Do you think that's a mistake of the IOC, or is it something that, in fact, there should be much focus on?
It's certainly something Ukrainians have been focusing on very significantly. President Zelenskyy made this a really impassioned plea last week, and it's not the first time he made a similar plea last month, calling on the IOC to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes from participating in the Olympics. And the argument of the Ukrainians is that essentially if you allow Russian and Belarusian athletes to compete, then that is, on the one hand, it is allowing the Olympics to be used as a propaganda tool by the Russians and by the Belarusians if they win medals. And on the other hand, it is not punishing athletes who, in actual fact, so, there's this idea that sport should not be politicized, but we've actually seen Russian athletes who are Olympic athletes appear on stage at rallies in favor of Putin and in favor of the war, draped in their Olympic medals. So they themselves have also made their Olympic participation political by appearing on stage at these rallies. So certainly the athletes have been used and are allowing themselves to be used in the war effort. And the Ukrainian argument is we shouldn't allow that to happen, because what can happen, and what we saw, for instance, at the Australian Open last month, was that you do end up having situations where a Ukrainian and a Russian athlete, for instance, are competing against one another. And what we saw in Melbourne Park was we had Russian supporters come out with Russian flags, Russian supporters heckling Ukrainian supporters. And of course, that infamous incident with Novak Djokovic's father appearing with Russia supporters carrying flags and symbols in support of Putin. So I think there is that element where sports has been used by the Russians. And the Ukrainians really are very strong that we shouldn't allow these sorts of things to happen.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Zoya, good to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.